Imagine waking up on a Tuesday morning in March. The birds are chirping, there's a hint of spring in the air, and you send your kids off to school without even a heavy coat. You think the worst of winter is behind you. But, within a few hours, the temperature plummets. The sky turns a bruised purple, and a wall of white hits your town with the force of a freight train. By dinner time, you are burning your own dining room chairs just to keep your children from freezing to death in your living room. This isn't a movie. This is what happened to thousands of people in 1888. Let me tell you how they survived the storm that changed everything. So, to really understand why this event was so terrifying, we have to look at where we were. We were talking about New York City and the American Northeast in March of 1888. And here's the thing, people were optimistic. It was the Gilded Age. We had telegraphs, we had steam engines, we had these new elevated trains rumbling above the streets of Manhattan. We felt like we had conquered nature. We felt modern. On the morning of March 11, it was raining a little bit, sure, but it was mild. It felt like spring was knocking on the door. You have to picture families like the Mullers, Friedrich and Helena. They were immigrants who came over from Germany looking for that classic American dream. They lived in a tiny tenement apartment on Orchard Street. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms. Really, but it was home. Friedrich went off to work at a garment factory, probably walking because the weather seemed fine. Helena stayed home with their 3 kids. Nobody checked a weather app. Nobody turned on the TV news. Back then, weather forecasting was basically a guy looking out a window and taking a guess. And that day, the guess was light rain. They were wrong. They were catastrophe level wrong. Two massive weather systems were colliding right over the coast. One was full of warm moisture from the Atlantic, and the other was a brutal, freezing air mass coming down from Canada. And when they smashed into each other, they created what we would call bomb cyclone today. But back then, they just called it the end of the world. By the afternoon, the rain turned to sleet, and the sleet turned to heavy, wet snow. Then the wind picked up. We aren't talking about a breezy day here. We are talking about hurricane force winds screaming through the concrete canyons of New York. Now, I want you to imagine being Friedrich. You're at work, the windows are rattling, and you look outside. You can't see the building across the street anymore. It's just a white void. The boss finally calls it quits, and thousands of workers spill out onto the streets, just trying to get home. This is where the nightmare really starts. The city's pride and joy. Those elevated trains stopped running. They just froze on the tracks. People were packed inside those wooden cars like sardines, shivering, with no idea when they'd move again. Friedrich was lucky enough to not be trapped on a train, but he had to walk. And walk is the wrong word. He was fighting. The snow was accumulating at an impossible rate, 4 inches an hour. Drifts were starting to cover first-floor windows, while he's fighting for his life outside. Helena is fighting a different battle inside. The temperature in their apartment is dropping like a stone. The coal bucket is getting low. And this is the part that always gets to me. She looks at her furniture. That table they saved 4 years to buy. The wooden chairs where they ate every meal. And she realizes that if she wants her babies to wake up tomorrow, she has to burn it all. Can you imagine that choice? Taking an axe to the only things you own, but she didn't hesitate. Survival strips away everything that doesn't matter now. I want to pause the story in New York for a second, because to really understand the trauma of 1888, we have to look at what happened just 2 months earlier, out in the Midwest. This is often called the Children's Blizzard, a documented tragedy that haunts the Great Plains to this day. It was January 12, 1888. Same year, different storm, but the same deadly surprise. Out in the Dakota Territory and Nebraska, it was a freakishly warm day. Kids went to school in light jackets. Farmers left their livestock out. Then, the temperature dropped 100 degrees in 24 hours. There's a story about a young teacher named Minnie Freeman. She was only 19, basically a kid herself. She's in this flimsy one-room schoolhouse made of solder and grass bricks. When the wind hits, it hits so hard the roof literally rips off. Now, Minnie has 13 students. The oldest is maybe 12, the youngest is 5. The storm is screaming so loud they can't hear each other. The snow is blinding literally. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. This is what they call whiteout. Minnie knows if they stay in the ruins of the school, they die. But the nearest farmhouse is a mile away. In a blizzard, a mile might as well be 1,000 miles. So, she does something incredible. She grabs a roll of twine they used for projects. She ties the children together, one by one, linking their wrists, and then she ties the end of the rope to her own waist. She tells them, do not let go. No matter what happens, do not let go. And they walk. They march into the white void. Think about the trust those kids had in her. Think about the terror in Minnie's heart. She's 19, leading 13 lives through a frozen hellscape. But she didn't stop. She stumbled, she fell, but she kept pulling that rope, and miraculously, they found the farmhouse. Every single one of them survived. But not everyone was Minnie Freeman. Across the plains that day, hundreds of children didn't make it home. They were found days later, sometimes frozen just a few feet from their front doors, disoriented by the whiteout. It's a heartbreak that's hard to even put into words. Back in New York, the sun has gone down, but it's not dark. It's a weird, glowing gray from the snow reflecting the gas lamps that are still flickering. Friedrich is still trying to get home. He's exhausted. His feet are numb, not cold, just gone. That's the danger stage. He sees people huddled in doorways, people who just sat down to rest for a moment and never got back up. He finally makes it to his building on Orchard Street. He climbs the stairs for flights on feet that feel like blocks of wood. He opens the door, and what does he see? He sees his apartment stripped bare. No table, no chairs, just a mattress on the floor in front of the stove. But on that mattress, under a pile of blankets, are his wife and children. And nestled in with them is the neighbor, Mrs. O'Brien, and her kids. See, that's the other side of this disaster. The cold broke down the walls between people. Mrs. O'Brien ran out of coal. Helena didn't ask questions. She just said, come in. They burned the furniture together. They pulled their soup. They shared their body heat. It reminds me of a documentary I watched recently about the storm that changed America. It made a great point. Disasters don't just destroy, they reveal. They reveal who we really are. And that night, in that tiny apartment, they were survivors. Friedrich collapsed onto the mattress. Helena rubbed snow on his frostbitten feet, which hurts like fire. By the way, as the feeling comes back, but he didn't care. He was home. The next morning, New York looked like a different planet. The East River, a massive, churning body of water, was frozen solid. And I don't mean a thin layer of ice. I mean, people were actually walking from Brooklyn to Manhattan on the ice. They set up little stands selling coffee and liquor on the river. It was surreal. But the fun didn't last. The city was paralyzed. No food was coming in. The milk trains were stuck in snowdrifts upstate. The telegraph lines were down, snapped under the weight of the ice. New York, the center of the world, was completely cut off. This is where the panic started to set in. You couldn't buy coal for any price. People who had laughed at the light rain forecasts were now facing the reality that they might freeze in their own brownstones. But, again, you saw this incredible resilience. Strangers formed digging crews. There were no snowplows, remember? This was all done by hand. Thousands of men with shovels, digging tunnels through drifts that were 20 or 30 feet high. They dug out the butcher shop first, then the bakery. There's a story about a wealthy banker who was stuck at a hotel. He was used to the finest things in life. By day 3, he was down in the kitchen peeling potatoes alongside the busboys because everyone had to pitch in to eat. The storm didn't care how much money you had. Cold is the great equalizer. Segment 6. The costs of survival. As the days went on and the snow finally began to melt, the true cost became clear. Over 400 people died in the Northeast. In the Great Plains, the number was over 200, many of them children. One of the most tragic stories is of a young teacher named Detta Shattuck in Nebraska. She got caught in the storm trying to go home. She found a haystack, just a pile of hay in a field, and burrowed into it. She stayed there for 3 days, 72 hours in a hole in the hay, while the wind howled outside. She survived, which is a miracle. But she lost both of her feet to frostbite. It's a brutal reminder of how close the margin was between life and death. And in New York, they found a man named George Barrymore. He was a merchant, a successful guy. They found him frozen to death in a snowdrift just 3 blocks from his home. He had walked miles, fought through the worst of it, and his body just gave out within sight of his own front door. It's heavy to think about, but it's important, because these weren't just statistics. They were people with families, with plans for next week, with dreams. So, why do we still talk about 1888? Why does this storm matter so much? Because it forced us to change. Before 1888, all the wires, telegraph, telephone, electric were strung up on poles above the streets. When the ice hit, those poles snapped like toothpicks, cutting off communication and electricity. After the storm, the city said, "Never again." They forced the utility companies to bury the wires underground. The first shovels went into the ground a few years later. Every time you swipe your card and get on a subway, you are riding on the legacy of that storm. It also changed how we do weather. The Weather Bureau, which eventually became the National Weather Service, was humiliated. They realized they couldn't just guess anymore. They needed better science, better communication, faster warnings. It was the beginning of modern meteorology. But for me, the biggest legacy isn't the subways or the wires. It's the families. Let's go back to Friedrich and Helena. They survived. It wasn't easy. Friedrich had a limp for the rest of his life from the frostbite. They lost all their furniture and had to start over. But they survived. Their kids grew up. Wilhelm, the oldest, became a foreman on a construction crew, maybe helping to build that very subway system. Carl became a teacher, perhaps inspired by the stories of those who saved students on the plains. And Greta, she had the most beautiful singing voice. She used to sing to her own grandchildren about the night they camped in the kitchen. They kept a piece of that night with them forever. They knew that life is fragile. They knew that comfort is a privilege, not a guarantee. There's a story that years later, whenever there was a bad storm, Helena would go to the window. She wouldn't say anything. She'd just watch the snow fall. And Friedrich would come up behind her, put his hand on her shoulder, and say, "We have coal. We have food. We are okay." And that was enough. You know, we live in a world where we freak out if the Wi-Fi goes down for 10 minutes. We get annoyed if the air conditioning isn't perfectly set to 70 degrees. We are so disconnected from the raw, brutal power of nature. The story of the blizzard of 1888 is a reminder. It's a reminder of how thin the line is between civilization and chaos. But more than that, it's a reminder of how tough we are. Think about Minnie Freeman tying those kids to her waist. Think about Helena Muller burning her wedding table to keep her babies warm. Think about the strangers digging tunnels to the bakery. When the world freezes over, when the lights go out, when the systems fail, we don't just give up. We grab a shovel. We hold on to each other. and we walk until we find the warmth. That's the lesson of 1888. The snow melts, the spring comes, but the strength it took to survive, that stays with us. I hope you enjoyed this journey back into the deep freeze. If you found this story as chilling and inspiring as I did, please do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, it really helps the channel, and make sure you subscribe to The Sleeping Historian. I've got so many more stories from the past that need to be woken up, and I want you there for them. Thanks for watching, stay warm, and I'll see you in the next one.